growing up, we learn about George Washington, we learn about all these folks that we're told are American history, but Japanese American incarceration history is American history too. It's something that we all inherit. And then using that sort of broadening and widening of what we think of as American history to bring in more stories from other communities that have also experienced this sort of silencing or siloing out of what counts. So broadening how we think about what history means, I think, is one of the most important ways to honor the folks who've done so much work to share their own lives and experiences and thoughts so that we can remember and know some of what happened.
Well, to me, when the framers of the Constitution said, a more perfect union, they were thinking that they had a vision. And I think what's incredible about that document, about that vision, is that we still have that vision of making it a more perfect union. And I think that the Japanese American incarceration story, from immigration all through incarceration up through redress, is just that. It's an example of the efforts to make a more perfect union and how a government can actually issue an apology with monetary support.
When you talk about Asian American history, you can't avoid talking about immigration and exclusion. And so tracing, I think, from the Chinese Exclusion Act, but you could go even earlier. But we'll start with the Chinese Exclusion Act and thinking about the ways that who is allowed to come into the United States and who is allowed to be an American citizen has been predicated on questions of race since the beginning. I think provides a really interesting lens for seeing the ways that all of these things are connected. We run the risk of sort of not digging in deep enough and not making the changes that we need to make within ourselves and within our communities and our larger society if we just look at the Black freedom struggle as a sort of standalone piece. It certainly serves as one of the foundations of the United States. This idea that we were founded as a nation on, enslaved labor and Native genocide and removal. But what does it mean to then also think about who was allowed to come in and who was allowed to be a citizen and how that connects to the ways that we think about race in the United States?
And then if you look through the history of the United States and citizenship, it's pretty, to see it on the arc, it seems like we should all study this arc, right? Of how Native Americans weren't even allowed to be citizens until 1924, and then African Americans, and so on and so on.
And so as I was sort of transitioning to look at Japanese American history, I learned that there were these two camps in the Deep South, in Arkansas, the sort of southeastern part of the state, deep in the Mississippi Delta. And that really surprised me because I had sort of assumed and thought of Japanese American incarceration histories as something that happened on the western half of the United States. Japanese Americans were removed from the West Coast and brought into the interior, but to places like Wyoming and Idaho. And so the question became for me, what did it mean to bring, 10,000 plus Japanese Americans, Asian American folks into the Jim Crow South in the 1940s? What did it mean to have this sort of specially segregated space within an already segregated social system in the South? So those questions sort of drove me to think about what it meant to have Asian Americans in this place that we often think of as existing as a binary, as a Black-white segregated space.
Well, for many people in the United States, not just Japanese immigrants, citizenship was conditional. Asians were denied the opportunity to become U.S. citizens, naturalized U.S. citizens. Certainly true with Japanese immigrants. Passage in the 1924 immigration law made that impossible. And so, you had this group of people who were essentially stateless. They couldn't become US citizens. They couldn't go back to their original country. So it was this kind of nebulous world in which they lived. Plus, 2/3 of the people at Heart Mountain were US citizens. They were born in the United States and by virtue of birthright citizenship were US citizens.
Yes, well, I think the study of Heart Mountain and the Japanese American incarceration in general, it shows that the concept of what it means to be American can actually be very cultural and have a bias to it. And as we saw, for example, because one of the determinants supposedly of having the camps is that people were being disloyal, right? And so this became sort of the bar for who can be a citizen or who's not, or who's American and who's not. And so they actually have the documents of how people were, especially with the loyalty questionnaire that came out. This was a questionnaire that seemed pretty innocuous, and it just had, where you were born and your birth date and things like that. And then the questions got asked about religion, and questions asked about what you studied, and questions about what you read at home and what languages you use. And and then of course there's the famous loyalty questions 27 and 28 about whether you would fight for United States if you were placed, or if you would disavow your loyalty to the Emperor of Japan.
And that's an awful question, because a lot of people, especially those who were born in the U.S., never had an allegiance to Japan. I mean, they were not immigrants; they were born here. And so, if you answered yes, that would be a lie, because that would mean that you used to have allegiance to Japan. And if you answered no, that's not correct either, because that also says you used to have allegiance to Japan.
I think perhaps best known are the draft resistors at Heart Mountain. There was a group of men who, some of them sort of banded together and formed something called the Fair Play Committee that basically said, you can't draft us until you restore our citizenship rights to us and to our families. It is unconstitutional for you to put us in these camps and then expect that we will serve in the military. There were other men at Heart Mountain who resisted the draft on their own, who didn't know the Fair Play Committee existed and ended up grouped in with them.
Well, upon hearing that, the government immediately filed the accusation that these people were violating the draft laws, and a criminal trial, a federal court in Cheyenne, Wyoming, was created to house, the largest ever jury trial in Wyoming. And it turns out the people were represented by an attorney who figured out it's better to have a trial by judge instead of a jury, because of the feeling that the people around the area would be highly biased against the Japanese. And it turned out that was a bad mistake. It was a huge mistake, because the judge, his name is Judge Kennedy, turned out to be a racist. He had a history of racism in his career that goes way back. But of course, the accused and the lawyer representing the accused had no idea of his background. And so it didn't take long for the Judge Kennedy to decide everyone's guilty.
But these were, ended up being the largest mass trial in Wyoming state history. All of these men were convicted and sent to federal prison. So going from this prison camp to a federal prison, either at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, or McNeil Island in Washington, and really suffered a lot. Both their families, who were sort of often became outcasts in the Japanese American community, because there was this emphasis on patriotism and military service that many folks chose as sort of the pathway back to citizenship. And it really has been the last 20 years or so that the stories of these resistors and other folks who sort of stood up and said, no, like, I'm not going to stand for what's happening to me and my family, or this is not a place that I want to stay and be a citizen of. Those stories were especially silenced within the Japanese American community, because there was this sense of folks needing to recover. And I think the reality is, these camps existed in the 1940s. This is before the sort of peak of the civil rights movement, when we have a sense of what resistance and protest looks like on a larger scale. And so when you're looking for moments of resistance in the camps, it can look really, really different. And to me, I think resistance can look like having fun, like finding moments of joy, like creating art, like singing, like playing a sport, something like that, continuing your life. That can be resistance as much as sort of an organized resistance. And the truth is that all of these things existed in the camps. And so some of the work of remembering is also thinking about, okay, how do we tell these stories? How do we honor our ancestors, but in ways that, have an impact on the present? How do we pull out patterns for folks to see? Not that Japanese American history is the only way to trace how, systems of immigration and exclusion and incarceration function, but it's a really interesting lens, I think, into sort of understanding how we've gotten to the various situations that we find ourselves in today. And some of that is recognizing within the Japanese American community how we can better align ourselves with, how we can better, reach across lines of community and race.
And it was admitted by the Commission for the Civil Liberties Act that this was a failure of, it was basically a racial prejudice that this whole system was based on, and wartime hysteria and a lack of political leadership. So there is an admission, a public admission that this was racial prejudice. And so we hold this up as an example of a policy that was actually based in racial prejudice, and how we can recognize this in the present and in the future so that it won't happen again, or that we can try to do something to prevent it from happening again, or recognize it and put up the flags that, hey, this is happening again.